Welcome to the Value Maker podcast. My name is Ryan Purvis. I'm your host, supported by Heather Bicknell, as we meet with the people that make the digital workspace work. It's about the technology, it's about improving people's work experience and finding the return on value. Adam, welcome to the Value Makers podcast. Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Adam Judelson. I'm the owner of First Principles Catalyst. It's a company that helps other companies that are building their products to build them in the best possible way, take advantage of that. We do product coaching and fractional product engagements. I myself am a native of Silicon Valley. I live in Los Angeles, lived all around, and I've had a really fun and exciting career across a lot of different startups, mostly in the product space.
Fantastic. So you're looking forward to the World Series then?
Oh yeah. Exciting. It's actually a little tense for me though, because I did grow up as a Yankees fan, but I've been in LA so long, I think I have no choice but to root for the Dodgers.
Yeah, fair enough. They bought the best team. They got to do it this again. So great. I mean, I grew up watching the Yankees. So I was rabbit hole for a little bit. And my godfather was from Connecticut and I was taught to hate the Yankees my whole childhood. And it was quite funny because that was the era where they were winning World Series after World Series and you just couldn't not be enamored with who they were and what they were doing.
Certainly an impressive track record.
Exactly. Great. So tell us a little how you bring value to your customers.
Yeah, we work with them on their product challenges. We do it through coaching and fractional engagements. So coaching is behind the scenes and we're helping somebody to build their own capacity on product. That can be working with the CEO to figure out how to manage their product team, how to hire a chief product officer for the first time, how to get the chief product officer and the CTO to work together. It could be working on the product strategy, could be working on the go-to-market, could be earlier stage, working on the value proposition. So really any of the types of issues that come up when you're trying to build a product, generally speaking, venture-backed product companies, although we do have some clients that are not venture-backed, but for the most part, it's venture-backed product companies and any of the challenges that arise in that life cycle. So we do that in the hands-off coaching manner where we support people from behind the scenes. And then we also do it in a fractional manner where sometimes a business will want it done for them and will implant somebody inside their team to actually do that work directly.
Do you think that there's a profile for a CPO that is consistent, or do you think they have to be something that fits the business that you're working with and what the business is building?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So I wouldn't have a business if I thought one size fits all, because I would argue that one of the reasons that we have a business is because everybody tries to shoehorn every single product discipline into one person, right? So it's one day you wake up, they're like, oh, you're the product manager. You must be able to run paid advertisements. You must be able to deal with enterprise sales. You must be able to deal with pricing strategy. You must be able to build space tech and teen dating apps at the same time. Those are two real examples, by the way, of things that we actually do work on. And the reality is there are a few people that I've met over my career that can operate pretty seamlessly across those different verticals and across those different use cases and across those different maturity levels for the client. But I find it's exceedingly rare. And so what we often try to do, the first part of any engagement is just figuring out what kind of a product expert does this company need? Is this a 0 to 1 play where they really need help getting their early adopters? Is it a growth scale up where they're really looking to optimize all of their metrics and add another 10% each month or each quarter or something like that? They're very different circumstances. For example, one of my public company clients is one of the top product people at a public company that you would recognize. And that client is focused almost exclusively on strategy work, stakeholder management, building coalitions, launching massive initiatives, right? We don't actually talk about the day-to-day nuts and bolts of the product very often. Whereas my earlier phase clients, we're pulling up design mocks, we're looking at what's going on now, we're pulling up the metrics, we're going through things at a much more granular level. And so it's different at every phase. And so we try to match ideally somebody that has both the industry experience and the phase experience with a particular client.
What's a bad combination for a product manager? You clearly see someone and you go, you're in the wrong role. Kind of feel like the product management role can sometimes be a catch-all role where they're not sure where to put somebody, so they put them there.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, that person's a bad BA only or a bad test or whatever.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I think the easiest way to describe it, and then I'll give you like a more tactical way of describing it, is that it's a person who does not care about the value, right? So if you care about the value that you're delivering to customers, you can probably find the right instincts to eventually learn how to be a strong product person. But if you only care about the process or you only care about the numbers, or you only choose any one of the other disciplines. If you only care about the quality, or you're an ex-engineer, become product manager, and the only thing that you care about is the velocity of the engineering team, you're going to fail eventually. Like every single one of those archetypes is going to fail. And the reason is because at the end of the day, companies only fund and continue to fund product investments that eventually return revenue. Even in a venture-backed context, though there's a longer timeline to accept a lack of profitability, eventually you have to produce value. And so I find that those other disciplines can be really good at making a good showing of things. Marty Kagan likes to call it product management theater. I think that's a great term for it, where you've got a lot of activity going on. You're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. You're very busy, but you haven't actually added meaningful value to a client. So I think that's a fail mode. I think another fail mode that's maybe a little bit less obvious is big company product manager in early phase company challenge, or early phase product manager in big company challenge, right? So the first of those two, they're going to over-index on looking for metrics, asking other people for help, expecting there to be a team that's going to take care of some discipline instead of rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty. And in the opposite regard, they're going to expect a degree of autonomy that is just very hard to give them in a large company, and probably will feel stifled by the amount of time they have to spend negotiating with other people in order to do the work versus actually doing it. So that can be another mismatch that I see frequently, where both of those people can be excellent product managers, but just at different phases.
Yeah, I can actually see that as you're talking about it, because my sort of roles have been more project manager / product owner, which works in some places as well, but not always. Again, depends on what kind of team you've got behind you to do stuff. And when I've been stifled, I can remember why I was stifled, because I come from one business where I had the autonomy, and I've gone into a business where you didn't have the autonomy, and the personalities you're working with were not necessarily the same driven personalities. More diplomatic, more lobbying before calls. It took me a while to figure out just lobby before the calls for the decision, and then have the meeting and have the decision. Whereas the previous place, whereas the previous place, everyone just decided in the meeting what was going to happen and was decided quickly. Yeah. And those are the sort of more A-type personalities versus the more, I would say B-type, but they were just different. They required lobbying.
Yeah, I'm strongly anti the job title of product owner. I'm not anti the people who occupy the role, but I'm anti the job title, because it implies that there's this person whose entire job is to basically be the deciding factor between a bunch of different decisions that need to be made and a bunch of different stakeholders. And it completely discounts the fact that the product person is actually responsible for figuring out if we're building something of value, not just trading off against a bunch of different people with different voices at the table. So it makes it more of a bureaucratic role and much less of a value-driven role. And now, don't get me wrong, I've seen product owners that have done fantastic work, but they're product owners who are operating far outside of the confines of what that role was built to be in an agile context.
You meet with somebody, it's their first day on the job. What would you talk to them about getting themselves ready to be in this role?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is, do you understand what people are trying to do in the first place? Do you understand what people were doing before your product existed? Do you understand how people are doing that work now that your product exists? Do you understand the market that your particular customer is sitting within, and how the work that they're doing fits into the grander job that they're doing? I'll give an example that's a silly one, but I think it's a good one. A lot of people make the joke about when Henry Ford was designing the first car, if he had interviewed his users and asked them what they wanted, they would say they wanted a faster horse, not a car. And I think that's a perfect example of the types of questions that people need to be asking in the early phase. Whenever anyone gives that example, they don't give the second half of the example, which is, how do you correct this behavior, right? And the way that you correct this behavior is that when you're talking to somebody about their transportation mechanism to work, which is what the horse was at that point in time, you need to understand the entire context of that person's life. What is it that you're doing before work? What are you doing after work? What are you doing during work? And it would only be after you learned that if they could spend more time at work, they would, and would then make more money, that it begins to make it possible to make the statement that, okay, if we had another way of getting them to work that was twice as fast as the horse, for example, and more stable and more reliable and didn't require being fed, would they actually adopt that? For that to be true, we first have to know that they would prefer to be at work for more time in order to make more money, right?
Yeah.
And if you only focus myopically on how do you get to work? How do you like to get to work? What time do you leave for work? What do you put on your horse? What do you take off your horse? If you're only focused on the horse, it's very difficult to build that holistic context and understand deeply what somebody is going to adopt or not adopt. And that's the devil of the whole discipline. I think the discipline of product would not exist or would only be the project management functions of product if it weren't for the value pieces. If you just knew everything that we're shipping is going to be extremely successful, then it would be a program management or a project management function. By the way, there's symptom of this all over the emerging tech world. If you look at some of the companies like SpaceX that are building technology where there's less of a market fit question. For example, if a reusable rocket exists, NASA will adopt the reusable rocket. Small satellite owners will adopt the rocket to send their payloads to space more cheaply than they could through a bespoke system. Because of that, more program management, more project management, and you see a lot less product management because there aren't as many questions of value. There aren't as many questions of internal viability. There aren't as many questions of craftsmanship of the thing, right? So it ends up boiling a little bit more down to, can we solve this technical risk? And if it's a purely, can we solve this technical risk question, you don't see a lot of product people. So for example, like super early phase life sciences companies building new medical treatments. I met a guy a year or two back who had a multi-billion-dollar exit in that arena. And it was one of the first people I had met at that time who had an exit in that particular arena. And I asked him the question that I always like asking founders, which is, how did you get your first 10, 100,000 customers? And he looked at me and he said, what do you mean? And I'm like the people paying for your product, like, where did you get them? And he just started laughing and he was like, I don't have any customers. And I was like, what do you mean you don't have any customers? You exited for billions of dollars. And he was like, yeah, we sold to a pharma company. They're going to take the drug the rest of the way. Our work is done here, right? So in companies like that, you need scientists and engineers and not necessarily product people.
Yeah. Oh, geez. What a different concept. My whole life has been finding customers and getting customers. So what is it? Is there another way?
It turns out there is, right? If you can solve some super core problem that everyone agrees is core. And I think the hard sciences have more problems like that than the rest of the market, where you can say, okay, everybody agrees that if you can do nuclear fission more safely, that will be valuable, right? Everybody agrees if my drone can fly for 10 times the amount of time because the battery is more efficient, but it's otherwise the same drone, that's a good thing to focus on. So those types of problem statements tend to be ones that are much, much heavier on engineering and much lighter on product people.
Yeah, fair enough. And where do you see a heavy focus on product people then? Is it the case where there's more B2B, B2C?
It's anywhere where there's a seam between those things. So the irony is I give that example, but I personally have a passion around emerging tech product management. And emerging tech companies, I would say, I don't know, a quarter to a third of them don't have a lot of product challenges. They are working on this frontier science work, and there's not a lot that you're gonna add to that equation. But let's take an example. I'll give an example that I think is an interesting one. There's a company here in Los Angeles called Apex Space. And Apex Space is building a universal satellite bus that can be adopted by satellite builders. So for people who don't know what a satellite bus is, you can think of it in terms of it being all of the core guts, but without any of the splash, right? So it's the solar panels, it's the power systems, it's all of the things that are going to connect the satellite together, but not the payload or the thing that actually makes the satellite money. So let's say you're building an imaging satellite that's going to take pictures. The payload, the camera, if you will, is going to be built by somebody, right? But that person needs to be able to fly their camera. So what are they going to fly it on? So that's the bus, is the thing that you're going to fly that camera on, for example. So they're building a generic bus that can be purchased by customers who want to put a satellite into space, which is great, interesting, exciting idea. But there are 100 craftsmanship questions that go into solving that. What should the power requirements be? What size should it be? What should the connection points look like between the payload and the rest of the device? What does the flight software need to be able to handle? How are we going to actually fly it? How are you going to maneuver it? All of these questions actually do lend themselves toward a product person or a product-minded engineer working through those challenges and trying to figure out what are customers going to adopt? Why would they adopt it? What kind of satellites are most likely to buy this? Like all of those sorts of considerations. So I think the short version to your question is almost every single other company other than pure hard science innovation companies have product challenges, B2C, B2B, large enterprise, small enterprise, you name it.
Yeah. I mean, your analogy, keeping with the space, reminds me of the Apollo 13 movie where they needed to build the air scrubber and they had to basically take the two aircraft and work out that all the pieces weren't actually the same size as the carbon dioxide. Things were cut differently. And I was like, who didn't see this being a problem?
Yeah.
It's this whole project.
I think that one's an interesting one because once the junk was dumped on the table, that became an engineering problem, right? We have these pieces. How are we going to put them together to solve the problem? Where I think the product person would have come in if that were a product scenario is actually in identifying, hey, the problem that we need to solve here that's going to be valuable is to make sure these guys can continue breathing, right? That's the value hunting piece. Because let's say this is a weird hypothetical because it's not really a product, but if you were a product manager looking at Apollo 13 and you identified, for example, that one thing that they could solve for was directing the capsule back to Earth. And that's really important because they won't survive if they don't come back to Earth. And another thing that they could work on was dealing with the air scrubber. Which one do you work on? That's a product decision. That's a value-based decision. And if they had chosen incorrectly, they would have all died, right? So that's a pretty visceral example. So that's the product side of that question. And then let's say they built that air scrubber and then they decided, hey, this air scrubber is really interesting. We're going to sell 1,000 more air scrubbers just like it for all of the next space capsules. Okay, great. What are we going to charge for it? How are we going to take it to market? What should be the specifications of this air scrubber? What should this air scrubber actually look like? In the Apollo case, they only needed one working one. So to me, that's solution engineering, which is very different than product engineering. Got some similar skill sets. You're still putting pieces together. You still need engineers in the room. You still need a project manager of some sort, but you're not necessarily building for the market. You're not trying to create something where the same item can be shipped to hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people, depending on the scale of your product.
And I think the important thing, which I'm getting from this, is how do you determine what the value is? And how do you measure it? How do you determine it? Because that is the hardest thing often to discuss with somebody.
It's so hard. And I think it's many different factors. And I think like anything that we're good at, we tend to discount how it is that we figure out how to do that thing. And it tends to be harder for us to explain how we do that thing. But I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I think I can offer a couple of helpful tips. The first thing is you really do have to understand like what is happening in the big picture and what's happening in the small picture. You got to understand, hey, these guys need to come back to Earth. And you've got to also understand, okay, here are how the different systems in the spacecraft work to even be aware of the fact that there's a system responsible for making sure there's enough breathable oxygen inside the space capsule in the first place, right? And so you've got to have that awareness. And I think that a big part of it is actually once you have all those facts, using sound judgment to compare what happens if we do this for 6 months, what happens if we do this other thing for 6 months, what would the outcome look like in these two cases? And you're also trying to think about the impact of the use case that you're working on is another way of thinking about it. You're thinking about the frequency with which the particular issue comes up. I'll give you an example. A very real problem for almost everybody in America is waiting for too long in line at the DMV. It's something we can all relate to. Yeah. So that validated problem, and it's an underserved need in that there aren't any good solutions to avoiding that line, right? But it's a terrible thing to build a product for. And it's a terrible thing to build a product for because if you ask yourself the question of how often does this pain arise and how painful is it when it arises, you get a really strong answer to the second question and a really weak answer to the first question. So if the pain is not going to arise on some sort of consistent basis, it's pretty hard to get people to pay a substantial amount of money. But take tax preparation. That's still an infrequent pain, but it comes around for people once a year. And since it comes around every year, you have this whole industry of software services all built around it. So you don't have to modify by much, but you do need to be thinking about how painful is this? How frequently does the pain arise? And then the simplest thing to ask is how underserved is this problem? Meaning, are there decent solutions out there? So I have a problem when I go to concerts, the music feels too loud and I want to protect my ears. But is that an underserved problem? There's 100 different types of earplugs that I can put in my ears to protect my ears. Some for musicians, some for fans, some cheap, some expensive. It's not an underserved market, even though there is a real need.
I love your example and the way you explain that because I have a very similar way of thinking of it. And I look at it from user impact, technical complexity, and that's not on my head now. organizational need.
Mm.
So those are my sort of three metrics, and I use a scoring system, high, medium, low, and the combination puts it in a quadrant. And that frequency that you're using, I use as, I just call it a measure, because you need to have some sort of sizing to what the issue is. And I found that a pretty good way to articulate value, and then using a perspective to it, because you're either reducing a risk, you're improving adoption, you are improving productivity, or you're reducing cost. And that kind of fits into what you've described there. And the DMV has a few things that you can make it cheaper, you could make it less complicated, et cetera, et cetera. And I come from South Africa originally, and I've been in the UK now 12 years, and it still fascinates me how process driven the UK is compared to South Africa, just because it's very common first world versus third world. Yet we can get a lot more stuff done in South Africa in a lot less time because it's not so process driven. It's because that value thing, and you mentioned the sort of service has been developed out of the pain, because there's no formalized process. There's always someone who can find a way for you to get it done faster, who can charge you a fee. And it's obviously not a big fee usually, because it's someone just making a little bit of money. When I first moved to the UK and I had this first process problem, I was like, okay, so here's what you need me to do. How do I get around your process? And the person was like, why would you want to do that? No one goes around the process. Like, yeah, but if I was in South Africa, I would speak
Go
to
around
this
the
guy,
process. Yeah.
and I'd pay him 200 rand, and he would find me a way.
Yeah.
And I would just be an unofficial, not necessarily a bribe, but I would find the way through the process to get it done quicker, because he would say it's an added value added service, and I would just pay, I get a receipt, and I'd walk out and I'd be like, that took me 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And you're telling me it's going to take me 7 hours. No.
So I think you'll appreciate this story, because my wife and I lived in the UK for a while, and we had our first kid there. And one of the first challenges that we experienced, by the way, I'll tie this back to product, because I think this is all about bureaucracy hacking, which is essential for any enterprise product.
Yeah, exactly.
And we wanted internet, and we were living in an old building that did not have a lot of internet. But when we contacted the internet service provider, they said, yeah, sure, we're happy to install internet. But when they got there the day of, it turned out the only way for us to get internet was for the guy to break onto the roof of the apartment and install like the dish on the roof, and then dangle the cable down like 7 stories on the outside of the building and into our window. Right. And of course we didn't know that this was happening in real time. While the installation was happening, we just thought he was busy doing the installation. Right. But when it was done, we saw there was like this cable dangling, and clearly this dish was up there. And so this created a bureaucratic problem for us in the UK, because the building, which was very process driven, as much of the UK is, came by for its like regular inspection, and they noticed this cable and they wanted to investigate what was going on. And by that time we had been living there just long enough that we had learned to use the bureaucracy in our favor when it was a problem. And what my wife had discovered was that, because she was pregnant for a big portion of the time that we were there, so she was at home more often and not at the office as often. And what she noticed was that when people would come to the house while she was there, it was still a little bit of a chauvinistic culture. And so they would assume that the woman wasn't going to take responsibility for any of the things related to the physical apartment. Or the tech. And so what she started doing is they would come to take a look at this, and she would say, oh, I'm so sorry, but my husband's just out. He's not available now. And they would be like trying to come in, and she would be like, it's just not possible. He's not here. Even though clearly the door is open, they could walk right in and they could figure this out. And so we managed to continue that charade for just long enough. And then the funny part of the story is, at the very end of our lease, the building manager made me uninstall it. And I didn't even have tools. We were living in an apartment. So here I am, like dangling over the side of the banister on the roof while he watches me like unscrew this satellite dish. So anyway, no damage was ever done, no harm, no foul. But it's a good example of learning how a different bureaucracy works, and then learning when you can actually leverage it to your advantage to get something done.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And it is funny how your goal was to get connectivity.
Right.
And you got connectivity. And from a user experience point of view, user impact point of view, you got what you needed, right? The complexity to get it and to keep it was high.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you were a sort of, I don't want to say law-abiding citizen, but if you followed that process, you would have lost your connectivity, which my second child was born during COVID. If you didn't have internet during COVID, what were you going to do? That's your TV, that's your work, that's your everything. It's just, It fascinates me sometimes how the process in some cases can be overriding to the value that the
Yeah.
person, that the end user or the customer is looking for.
I will say this. I totally agree with that. I will say this in favor of the process for a moment. So I worked in government early in my career, and I've
Yeah.
interfaced with a lot of governments and a lot of very large organizations at Slingshot, at Palantir, at Deloitte, all over. Like I've always interfaced with big organizations and small ones. And what I have noticed is the following: process is excellent at one thing, but one thing only, and that is handling the routine. So
Yes.
if you can identify a way to make your request look routine and disguise it as the routine thing, you will get it done. For example, the NHS in the UK, mixed bag, right? If you're an American, you think it's amazing because you don't pay. If you're a Brit, you like it some days, don't like it other days. But I'll give you an example of something they do really well. They deliver babies really well. It happens all the time. A lot of the population is going to be pregnant. They know how to deal with that. God forbid you have a rare form of cancer that doesn't have a known treatment. The NHS is hell, right? And so that's where, and I don't think that's not a critique of the NHS. That's just a critique of large bureaucracies. Large bureaucracy,
Mm.
it's easy to pay your parking ticket because parking tickets happen a lot, but it's
Yeah.
hard to, there's this story in California from many years back where this guy made his license plate say NUL, null. Right. And he thought he was like a computer guy and he thought this would be like a really funny joke to make it say null. Except a lot of the IT systems were not, they were not advanced enough to handle it saying null. So they treated his registration as null and he began
Yes.
receiving fines for not paying for his registration, even though he had paid for his registration because they couldn't match up the records. And the poor guy, I think the story is that it took years for them to sort this out. So that's an example of going outside the bureaucracy and paying the price for it.
I really thought you were going to say that he never paid anything because the record will always be corrupted and they could never check it down. But
I
it
forget
went
the
the wrong
exact
way.
details.
Yeah.
But it was a mess. I think he regretted it in the end, although very clever.
Oh, well, brilliant. Yeah. And it's funny. You make the point about process being good for routine. And it is. I mean, talk about the baseball analogy. Baseball is a game of routine. And if you can do the basics, and when I say the basics, and obviously the basics are quite sophisticated in a lot of ways, all the plays you need to know and situational stuff, but you practice those things ad infinitum every day. So when it's time for the special play that you need to pull out of nowhere, you can because you've done the basics 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, whatever it is. But you need to have, and to me, that's the problem with a lot of processes. They don't have the exception rule.
Right.
Like, how do you get out of, okay, so we have a process for organizing requirements. We have a process for organizing bugs, and we merge them together so we can organize our sprints and our approach to work. But where's the escalation process? How do you break it when we break glass, fire drill, have major issue with customer, needs to circumvent everything? How does that work? And how do you
Yeah.
solve that problem?
Yeah. I always tell people, and I named my firm First Principles because I'm a huge believer in first principles thinking. And I think that this is the key. The key is I'll take a really simple example. You launch a new product and you want to have some sort of welcome email go out to the customer when they sign up for the product. Very common use case. Pretty much every product on earth has a welcome email at this point of any real repute, right? And so the thing that most people will do is they'll say, we founded a company, we started a product. Joey, make the welcome email. And then Joey says, great. Okay. Like I'll go find someone else's welcome email I like, and I'll just copy that for our product. And boom, we've got a welcome email. The problem is nobody stopped to ask, why do we have welcome emails in the first place? What does a welcome email solve for? And what would it solve for our clients specifically? Now we have to be careful because if we first principles our way through every single question, we will never move, right? The velocity will just come to a crashing halt. But if we use first principles thinking sparingly or on the most important problems, then we can actually make bounds and leaps forward. It may be the case that for your product, the welcome email actually needs to get them to adopt a particular feature. And if you don't mention that feature in that email, that user is an attrition case, right? And so that would be really unfortunate to go copy somebody else's successful email, not realize that it had a specific need in your context, miss it, and then just move on. So I encourage people to think about that as a way to hack the process. And I always try to tell people like process it's there to support you. It's not there for you to support it. And if you
Mm.
end up subordinate to your own process, for example, a very common one is we have a giant crisis. We've fixed it for the customer, but the release cycle says that we can't release this change for 2 weeks or something like that. Or in some companies' cases, 3 months. And I think that's just such a silly problem to have because the process doesn't work for you. Or sorry, the process does work for you. You don't work for it. If your customer needs that thing and you believe that it's a safe and fair release and it's been tested and you're ready to ship it, ship the sucker. Ask people to
Yeah,
spend
yeah.
a couple of
100%.
hours and get the thing done, right? That's the difference between the fast companies and the rest sit there and they say, we didn't go through the 47 slide change management slide deck before we did this. Did we ask the questions that are in that deck? Yeah, we covered those. Okay, so there's no real risk. No, there's no real risk. So then just ship it. Like, we don't need to coordinate this meeting and have 27 people show up and wait 3 weeks to get it on the calendar. Just go do it.
I have worked in some organizations where meetings are job creation and job safety. And you'd rather, and I've always appreciated organizations that release and fail forward. They'll release a fix, if it's broken, they'll release another one and they'll fix it in the next release, but they can do release every 5 minutes or release every hour.
Yeah.
And yes, it's almost sometimes testing in production. In some cases, it's a critical application to be updated quickly. I think
And
Facebook did that for a while.
Yeah,
sorry,
look,
go ahead.
engineers have to know that there's a trade-off to shipping fast. And that
Hmm.
trade-off to shipping fast is that you have to have a quality control system. And that can be an automated quality control system in the form of test automation. It doesn't have to
Yep.
be work that somebody does. But what people like to skip over is, oh, Facebook releases to 5% of the marketplace and they can release every single commit. And oh, isn't it amazing? And it is amazing. But do you know how much work they put into their test automation? I actually know one of the guys who worked on that. And one of the things that he told me that was shocking the first time I learned about it was they have so many tests that they can't run all the tests on every commit because the compute is too expensive and too costly for the production level they're doing. So they actually have algorithms that they've written to try to determine which subset of tests to run for a particular commit on an automated basis. So these companies have
That makes
invested
sense. Yeah.
in extremely sophisticated control systems in order to be able to release every commit. But I will tell you, I don't work with a single company where I don't insist hard that they make it so that every single commit can be a release candidate. That doesn't mean you're going to release it. That doesn't mean that you're going to think everyone is safe. But if it's not viable, if you don't have a CI/CD process to achieve that, you'll always be behind. And so it's very critical.
Yeah.
Now, look, you may still decide that you're only going to release every 2 weeks or 4 weeks. That's up to you. Maybe your customers maybe you don't think your customers need it more often than that. I think that's usually incorrect, but there's different industries with different needs. The more regulated the industry, sometimes the less frequent they want to see releases. But let's put it this way. I've been in the hell that is created from going the opposite direction before CI/CD principles worked. And what you end up with is hundreds of customers on different versions of your product, none of whom you can support properly, all of whom are angry. So that's not where you want to end up.
And there's nothing worse than that conversation with the customer saying, oh, you need to upgrade to the next version, but we can't give it to you till it's we'll give it to you next week. You've broken it and I need to do it today. And you tell me next week. You can't win that conversation. There's no happiness for anybody.
No, and you end up losing strategically because they end up adopting a product that doesn't have that constraint.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. 100%. I'm curious on your thoughts on what actually an MVP is, an minimum viable product.
Yeah, it's got to be the minimum amount of value that is required to move the needle on one important piece of the mission for your customer. And that piece of the mission should be solved really well, not in some like crappy, degraded way. And I think this is where I tend to differ as compared to other people. And so what I like to do is take a really narrow vertical slice of the problem as opposed to a really narrow horizontal slice of the problem. And what I mean by that is, I'll give an example. I've been starting to work with some more synthetic biology companies lately. And one of the things that the synthetic biology companies talk about, especially in the realm of drug discovery, is there are all of these calculations that you can perform on molecules, basically to get a number that tells you whether or not a particular molecule is more or less likely to do the thing in the human body that you want it to do. And each of these has a different name and each has different science behind it, blah, blah, blah. We don't have to get into any of that to make the point. And, what you have to do is you have to figure out like which piece of this do they actually need to test the value? So let's say you choose one of those calculations, like the binding energy of the two compounds, for example, and you decide we're going to build something that makes a better calculator for the binding energy between these two molecules. What you can't do is ship a quote unquote MVP that produces a score for that binding energy that is inferior to the current open source library that will calculate that binding energy. That is not an MVP. It might feel like it because you can hit the calculate binding energy button and it produces a number. So it feels MVP because it's functional, but it's actually not superior in any way to what those people were doing in the past. I'll give you an opposite example, though, of an MVP that I actually built to solve one of my own problems. I haven't even marketed, but I think it's coming to mind, and I think it's a good example. My wife and I share a credit card, and we each are users on the account, but it's incredibly difficult to get real-time balance information from the credit card company because they don't want you to know how much you're currently spending. So if you manage your finances on a credit card, you typically only find out once per month or as often as you have patience to log into their system, right? So the problem statement's pretty straightforward, and it's, I need a way to get my balance without having to log in. And so the MVP actually can be really narrow because all it needs to do is go look at my transactions, do some calculations, and send me an email. That is, in fact, a large step above what I experience now, even though it's not a whole lot of code to get to that first initial increment. But I'm using it. I've already had other people adopt it, even though I'm not even trying to market it. And so that's a sign. That's a sign that your MVP has some legs behind it because people have this problem and it does just enough to prove that thing at high value. Going back to our binding energy example, let's say the most accurate open source model is 60% accurate and ours is 80% accurate. And that difference in 20% can save each researcher 2 weeks every single time they evaluate a new molecule, and they evaluate 20 molecules a year. Fantastic. Yeah. That is a solid MVP that you should be proud of. You should get that out into the market. But if you're only adding like this much incremental value on top of what someone's already doing now, it's pretty hard. I'll give an example of a really difficult MVP market. Mugs, right? A lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to create a mug, but this one's funny here. I'll show you this one. This one, it looks like an Excel spreadsheet and it says freak in the sheets, right? So this mug breaks through because it's just funny enough that it's differentiated from the other mugs. But pretty much everybody else's cockamamie idea for a new mug, though it might seem like every mug on the planet exists, I dare you or any of your listeners to try to make a new mug that is the same size and shape as every other mug with a new design and see if you can sell it. It's extremely difficult because there's not enough differentiated value. So it's not really an MVP. Just because the product can be stamped out doesn't mean you've hit MVP.
Yeah. It's funny. I have these things with t-shirts. I have all these slogans for t-shirts. And often I think, who would actually buy this t-shirt? Because I think nowadays it's so easy to do something with like Printify or any of these sort of services on demand printing, and you can put up your own thing, but you might sell one, and then maybe somebody else will see it on your desk and they might buy it, but you're not going to, there's just so much in the market.
Just a quick thinking heuristic on this. I recommend people try to make it so that their MVP or their new feature is cool enough and adding enough value that they would feel really comfortable showing it to their smartest friend. And I think people tend to think the opposite. They tend to think, if I show it to my dumbest friend, what will they say? But if you show it to your smartest friend and they say, oh, that's pretty interesting, and they actually think about adopting it, that is teaching you something. But take your t-shirt example. Anyone who's ever created a t-shirt knows they can't even get their own family and best friends to buy the t-shirt. And that's your first sign that this is not the road you want to be on, right? You need to come up with a better t-shirt.
So it's funny, I've been on the carnivore diet for a few months now. And one of the t-shirts I've got is a carnivore slogan. And my wife and I have had the biggest fight about this t-shirt that I want to have made. And it's nothing like sensational or whatever it is, but because she still thinks I need to eat vegetables. And I have blood tests and all the rest of it, and all my bloods are better. And this is breaking all the science we were taught as kids. You have to eat from all the food groups and et cetera, et cetera. And it's been so funny because now my mom and I were discussing the same t-shirts and she started arguing with me about the slogan because she's saying it's also offensive. And I'm like, it's not offensive. It's like the most innocuous thing, but because you're challenging someone's belief system. And that's why I know I'll make t-shirts for myself. But it's funny how your market testing can actually be completely counterproductive to what you think it is.
Yeah. The best way to test a t-shirt or a slogan is to tell somebody what it is and see if somebody else will tell you about that same thing through the chain of referral. So I'll give you an example. I saw a
Okay.
t-shirt the other day that said, Pluto, we remember, right? In other words, for people
Yeah.
who grew up at a time when Pluto was a planet and now it's not a planet anymore, like we remember. And it's funny. And I'm here and I have no commercial relationship with whoever made that t-shirt. I'm telling you about it. And you might tell somebody else about it. And so if it would get back to you, it's probably viral enough to be a t-shirt. Now, look, on the bright side, t-shirts are very inexpensive to knock out the first few units of. So it's not really that big of a deal to experiment with a small batch of t-shirts that nobody really buys, right? We care more about testing the more expensive it is to get to that MVP, right? So in the software world, especially in the emerging tech world, like if you're building a new satellite, it might cost you 15, 20, $30 million just to get that first satellite up into space. So you want to do a heck of a lot of testing. If you're building a new consumer app that doesn't make a whole lot of modifications, maybe it's only 10, 20, 30, $40,000 worth of software engineering. Heck, maybe there's something you can just put a landing page up for and sell pre-orders, right? So you have to calibrate the amount of testing based on how much the uncertainty is going to cost you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%.
Sometimes it's just fun to print something. I don't have a problem with that.
That's exactly. I've actually got a list of all these t-shirt ideas, and I think I'm gonna get to a point where one weekend I'm going to figure out how to do these designs using some tool that does t-shirt designs and just create the store and see what happens.
Yeah, that's the thing is the irony will be you'll create your own tool for making the t-shirt. You'll sell that for $1 billion, but you'll never sell your own t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I was curious to know your thoughts around something like testing. So typically testing would be a function on its own, but do you think it's something that potentially should belong in the product team or be its own thing? Or do you have testing in different places? In engineering?
I think there's at least 3 levels of testing, and most teams don't even do 1 level of testing. And I think all 3 of these are extremely important. Let me start with the more mundane ones. The first one is let's make sure that every edge case is covered and that we don't have any unexpected bugs. What I'm talking about here is we launch in a weird browser. We open 3 windows at the same time. This person cancels their subscription and resubscribes within 5 minutes. Things that are not expected that are going to eventually lead to customer support issues and cost the company money. These are things that are great for manual QA, for maybe in some cases for automated tests. That's one whole realm of testing. I don't think that needs to belong to product. I do think product needs to prioritize the results of those tests, but I don't think it needs to belong to product. The second more mundane style of testing that I think has to happen is basic smoke testing by engineers. I've seen a lot of teams where really talented, well-intentioned engineers, quote unquote, ship a feature, tell you it's done, which I always joke is a 4-letter word. And you go log into the product and you can't even see the thing that was supposed to be there, or you see the thing and you press like the first and only button, and the first and only button is completely non-functional, right? So
broke to my machine.
Yeah. So for any reasonable velocity team, the engineers got to do their own smoke test. They've got to fire the thing up not on their same conditions, in an actual environment, not locally, make sure the darn thing works, right? At least to the best of their knowledge of what the use case is. And then the most important, I don't think product has a role to play in that, other than making sure it happens. The part where product needs to play a huge role and where like 85% of the value is created is taking that early version of the feature and going and putting it in front of people and having them try to use it. And also doing that themselves and figuring out like, where are people going to get stuck based on what we already know about our customer? Where did our design fall short? What conditions did we not consider in the real world that we should have considered? And I will tell you, I've been through so many different builds and so many different designs and so many different products. And the reality is you just can't predict all of them. You cannot predict well as you think what people are going to do once they start using it. And that's one of the huge places to get feedback on the value of the product. When you put it in front of somebody and you built 47 buttons, just to make a simplistic example, and they only click 3 of those buttons, that's a huge signal. Let's say that happens 10 times in a row. That's a huge signal that probably a huge number of those buttons could just go away.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got so many stories like that where we've built stuff and we've sat with the SME and they've suggested a whole UI UX experience, and we've gone through it and we said, are you sure this is what people want? Oh, this is exactly how they want it. And we've taken it to that first round of testing and it's been all thrown out. Like maybe one thing has survived, not necessarily 99% of the stuff has survived. And I remember building an inspection tool, which was iPad based, iPad minis. And we obviously delivered the iPad minis to all the exec so that they could have their inspection tool. We got an email from one of them saying, I don't know why you sent me a picture frame. Oh dear. So, you can do everything you want, but if you haven't got the education, it's going to be a rough ride no matter what.
Ideally, you're testing with designs and you're even testing in user interviews without even a design to reference to validate the assumptions before you're ever getting to the point where you've got to ship something. That would be my advice to people. But once you get to the mature side, those are the 3 styles of testing that I would make sure are happening all the time.
And I think you've got to avoid your own echo chamber.
Oh, yeah.
Where I've always liked to have as many people involved in reviewing stuff as much as possible. And I think sometimes there's a fear that if you involve too many people, you get too many opinions. But I also think you need to have all those opinions sometimes, because it's easier to change something in a Figma design than it is to change something that's now been coded, tested, and gone through a whole sprint, for example. And I think it's a confidence thing that it's okay to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you have to accept the information, but where I think a lot of product judgment is often not used is in determining whose feedback actually matters in the moment, given a particular strategy and a particular vision. And I think that's where people end up in this tough spot where they're like, I better not ask for it, because if they ask, then if I ask for the feedback and they tell me something I don't want to hear, I'm going to have to implement it. And I think that just comes from a place of, I don't want to say personal weakness, because there are often bureaucratic constraints as well, but it's organizational weakness that you can't say no in that moment if it doesn't actually fit. So I think gather all the signal, but then try to understand, okay, this customer has really good feedback, but they're talking about something that we won't even start building for 6 months, and we won't even penetrate that part of the market for 6 more months. So we can't prioritize that right now. We need to prioritize that other thing. And I think that's where the judgment comes into that decision process.
100%. And I think part of being a stakeholder managing person, I don't know it doesn't have to necessarily be a product manager, but anybody, is being able to say no without saying no. Well, that's a great idea. We'll put it on the list or whatever it is, and let me come back to you. Not necessarily saying no. And I think that's where a bit of experience comes in over time. As long as the person feels like they've been heard, you'll get more feedback. Have you ever read the MOMS test?
Yeah. Good book. Yeah. Solid.
A lot of things you suggested, I think I would probably resonate from that. I've heard the same thing in the book, and I'm trying to reread it again at the moment. And I liked your example of asking your smartest friend. In fact, I think you should ask all your friends, but I think you've got to get them to be brutally honest with you.
Let me rephrase, because if we're going to use it in a vigorous example, we should only be asking friends that have the pain that our product is designed to solve. The rest of the friends are just offering an opinion, right? But if let's say it's a true consumer product that anybody could use, then sure, you could ask any one of your friends. But if they don't actually care about that problem, then you're not going to get meaningful feedback from them. But choose the person who is most likely to disqualify your product, because if you build from a place of the people who would disqualify, your product will be amazing for the people that have low standards. And it'll also be amazing for the people with high standards. But if you do the opposite, man, good luck ever breaking into that top tier. It's just not going to happen.
100%. And it was a great chatting with you. We're running out of time. Is there any one thing you want people to follow up with you on, website or LinkedIn or?
Sure. I'd love people to check out the product newsletter we have. It's called Emergent. It's at www.emergentproduct.com. We share tips and thoughts from the field, videos. We have a roundup of the best product content from the internet. And we have periodic releases for our Emerging Tech podcast as well. So would love to see people there. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you.
Super.
Thank you for listening to our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. Help us grow our network. Please also check out our website at www.valuu.work and our product that's on there. It's something we worked really hard on. We hope that it benefits you.